Has anyone got any questions for John?
Just curious, one of the things I remember reading about Ukraine was that the enormous wheat fields and the enormous wheat harvesting they did every year supplied an enormous of the need of Western Europe. And that was one of the motivating reasons for the European Commission saying they were going to back off Russia because that's the wheat we consume here in the West. What's happened to all that wheat?
Sure. Well, certainly Russia was very quick to blow up the ports where the wheat was being offloaded onto ships to go to Europe. So Russia was very keen to destroy that. A lot of the wheat fields have been mined, so you can't walk through them or do anything with them. So the amount of wheat they produce is less. The war certainly didn't start because of wheat or food. It's just a totalitarian dictator who believes that Ukraine should not exist as a country. It should be Russia. They should speak Russian and they should worship me like everybody else. He's just like Hitler. So he will invent reasons to try and persuade the public to believe that he's fighting a just war. So a lot of what you hear is Russian propaganda, just like Hitler put out an awful lot of propaganda. Europe generally has been and still is very slow to react. Some of it was more to do with fuel. They realised that if Russia turned off the taps, they would be in a perilous position. So there was some hesitancy, I believe, from the fuel. A lot of hesitancy generally about they weren't ready. Russia was clearly ready for the war. It had started it. It invaded Ukraine in 2014. Before that, Georgia in 2008. It's always been on a war footing, a very active footing, and Europe has been going the other way around. Less and less GDP, and if it is spent on defence, it's not really defence. So they're trying to catch up now. I looked at figures a few weeks ago. The US is still the biggest giver to Ukraine compared to all of Russia, all of Ukraine, all of Europe combined. So if you look at so far going backwards, so as much as my wife and I and many others wish America was doing more, it's not their war, so I'm just so grateful they're doing something. And I wish the Europeans had never put their head in the sand, and I really think they should be doing a lot more now, but that's a bit of geopolitics. So yeah. But please ask any questions you like about geopolitics or any ideas that you've heard about the war, you're not sure if it's true.
You were talking to me the other day about people in Russia, if they don't go to the Russian Orthodox and they go to another church, that there are armed people, armed soldiers,
Sure.
taking photos of faces, etc.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that?
Yeah. So Russia now calls all the bits that it's taken over Russia. So as far as they're concerned, Crimea is Russia now. The land that they took yesterday, that's Russia now. So already they start grabbing the kids, sending them to school, and they're learning Russian history. They're learning that my dad was on the wrong side of a war and he's dead because he was fighting for the Nazis. They talk about, Russia talks about Ukraine and Europe being very pro-Nazi. They talk about them being Satanists. So I've looked actually in the Russian print, it actually is de-Satanization. I actually asked one of my Ukrainian friends, Sergei actually, he's Russian stock, I said, does this word mean what it means? He goes, yeah. And later on I rang him again. I said, they're now wanting to de-sanitize Ukraine. I said, we talk about sanitisation in a hospital. You wipe the benches to kill everything. He said, yes, that's what we use the word for too. So it is very much in their eye, their target, that these Ukrainians should not exist as Ukraine. And Protestant churches are particularly attacked, lots of torture, lots of congregations. If you still meet, as Selwyn and I were talking about, they will get your biometric data, your thumbprints or whatever else, so they know you're on the watch. They'll threaten the pastor's children. and tell the pastor, unless you stop, this is what's going to happen to your daughter. So it's the UN has called it systematic torture in Russian occupied territories. So it's very bleak. Yeah, so I think that answers your question.
I don't know how they do it.
Mm.
We had a TV program, I think it was on Sunday night or Monday night, and it was talking about the fact that Australia's defence is very poor, and even came out today that if there was China attacking Darwin, Darwin would only last about 12 hours, and they'd run out of ammunition. I mean, we are in a war, a spiritual war, and a war to keep our own country.
Yeah, and certainly, of course, we've travelled in some of the border countries. Many of those people, but not all, many of the citizens in the border countries know their necks. Moldova, civilians that we met, they won't even put up a fight. Russia will just take this place, we've got nothing to fight them. Poland's ready to fight, they're really, really afraid, and of course Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Yeah. So they all know that it won't stop at Ukraine. Putin's idea is to have an empire as big as Tsar Peter the Great, which was bigger than the USSR. So if you can remember how big the USSR was, expand those borders out further, and then you've got the borders of Tsar Peter the Great from the 1700s. That's who he's got a picture of in his wall. Not Stalin, not Lenin. It's Tsar Peter the Great. That's the empire he wants.
Anyone else? Anyone else got a question? I remember the Ukraine produced one of the biggest aircrafts. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And one of the reasons why Ukraine was an attractive target is a lot of industrial nuclear weapons. And so you have the US with nuclear weapons and a handful of other countries. And suddenly there's this new independent country that by virtue of its inheritance has got all these USSR nuclear weapons. And the United States is particularly uncomfortable about this. And they wanted a thing called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They wanted to keep the number of people in the club with nuclear weapons to a minimum. So they cajoled and pressured and persuaded Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons, to sell them to Russia. They were given money to sell their stuff to Russia. It wasn't millions and millions of dollars, I think it was 600,000 US. And Ukraine was very uncomfortable about this. It wanted this magic word called a guarantee. Now you might think a guarantee and a warranty and an assurance are all the same. But if you've ever been involved in legal contracts, you realise that no, they're not all the same. And the US, and eventually the UK were in on this treaty, called the Budapest Treaty. US and UK, they would not use the word guarantee, because in international law that means something. And Ukraine knew that they needed that word. But Ukraine still felt that they had to give in. So they sold all their nuclear weapons, left themselves totally defenceless, on an assurance, that's the word, assurance, that the US and the UK would come to their aid if ever they were attacked. And what did Barack Obama do in 2014 when Russia took Crimea, roughly 18% of the country? He just blinked. A couple of sanctions, that's all. And yet he's a representative of one of the biggest, the most powerful country in the world, and he gave an assurance, he and his forebears. So yeah, they feel a bit ripped off. Really ripped off. Yeah, I've
just been reading a book written from a Christian perspective in Iraq as to what happened after America got out. Just insurgency, absolute chaos.
Yeah. If I was an American citizen, I would probably generally make my vote be based on domestic policies. I think many people in most countries when they vote for a politician, they're just thinking about their domestic situation. But yeah, it's been very difficult, but thankfully America's still getting some money. Thankfully Europe's getting more money, but it's just too little. It really is. It's very sad when you're there and you see in the streets all these people missing so many bits of the body.